The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, saw rapid industrial growth, and with that, a host of dirty, dangerous, and downright dreadful occupations. As per usual, it was down to the poorest in society to toil in these horrific conditions, often just to survive. And so today, we're going to talk about 10 of the most terrible Victorian jobs, each with a bit of an overview about the conditions, the responsibilities, the hazards, sometimes the wages as meager as they were, but also about how Victorian society viewed the work. And before we begin, allow me welcome you to the channel. If you are new here, I invite you to subscribe, and I remind everyone that this channel remains 100% ad-free due to the generous support on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation through PayPal and YouTube Super Thanks, along with the... what's the other one? Oh yes, the merch store. Can't forget about that, can't we? But of course, the best support you can give us is just word of mouth. Liking, commenting, subscribing, all that sort of thing for the algorithm, and hitting the hype button. Tell all your friends who are sick of being interrupted by ads that there's a channel out there where they don't have to worry about it. And then we can all sleep a little better. In any case, with introductions out of the way and shameful e-begging said and done, allow us to begin our video for today. Now, when we think of the Victorian era, we certainly have this image of a chimney sweep, don't we? We have those Dickensian stories that are somewhat responsible for putting this idea into our heads. And yes, the reality comes with a lot less singing and merriment. Cleaning soot from inside narrow chimneys, that was their responsibility. But the one thing that was true about the Dickensian method of showing us this kind of occupation was that, indeed, it was frequently young children who were doing this job. With a brush or scraper in hand, climbing boys, or sometimes girls, but usually boys, as young as 4 or even 5 years old, would shimmy up the flue to remove the accumulation of ash and soot. Not an easy job. They had to use elbows, knees, and just shimmy up with their backs to scrape the chimney walls as they made their way through narrow, winding brick passageways that in some places were only about 9 inches wide. While the child workers typically received only food, a place to sleep, or a meager wage for their dangerous labor, the older master sweeps, as they were called, oversaw them and collected fees from the clients. Of course, one can imagine that the conditions were notoriously terrible, and that is going to be a prevailing theme for this entire video. They came out of chimneys covered from head to toe in soot, working entirely without protective gear such as gloves or masks. Many lived in filthy conditions, with the master sweep after being sold by impoverished parents or as orphans. In order to keep the kids small enough to fit into chimneys, the masters had a very interesting method. They didn't give them much food. They gave them a little, but just enough to keep them thin enough to do the job. It was a very dark, claustrophobic, and difficult experience to breathe inside the flue. The skin would be scraped and cut by the sharp bricks. A child would occasionally become trapped in a chimney too, frantic as they became wedged in the slender shaft. In severe situations, ruthless parents would even light a fire underneath to push a terrified child upward, putting them at risk of burns or asphyxiation, a practice which was, thankfully, later outlawed. Workdays began early in the morning, and might involve climbing and crawling up and down several chimneys throughout the town until they were just too tired to continue. Chimney sweeps had long-term health effects, as one can imagine. Lung damage and chronic respiratory issues were brought on by soot inhalation. Their skin was constantly irritated by coal tar and ash, which caused excruciating eye inflammation and coughing fits. One of the earliest known industrial cancers, actually, chimney sweeps cancer, was infamously common in teenage sweepers. There's only a few years you can go until you get something like that. In 1775, Sir Percival Pott actually discovered this disease, so this is quite early, a squamous cell carcinoma of the scrotum, and connected it to exposure to soot. Victims experienced potentially lethal foul sores, and they even got the name soot warts. Due to years of their bending, the developing bodies in narrow chimneys, many sweeps had malformed ankles, knees, and spines. Suffocation if trapped or unconscious in the smoke was a constant risk, as was falling from roofs and chimneys too. But surely they were well compensated for this. Well, I'm afraid not. Child chimney sweepers made very little money. The child climbers received little more than the bare necessities of food and shelter. Although a master sweep might charge his clients a few shillings per chimney, always somebody at the top. For their efforts, some kids got a few pennies or a small amount of food. In essence, rather than being paid workers, the majority of climbing boys were indentured servants. Chimney sweeping services were inexpensive and common in urban areas due to the low cost of child labor. Climbing boys were gradually replaced by professional adult sweeps with long brushes by the middle of the 19th century, but only after legislation and public outcry. Child sweeps have long been viewed as a depressing reality by society, to the point where they are mentioned in nursery rhymes and Victorian literature, such as the gloomy kids in William Blake's The Chimney Sweeper, which perfectly sums up the feeling of the daily life of those. Even though they knew a small child was scuttling throughout their chimney, many middle-class and upper-class homeowners simply chose to ignore the situation. Reformers such as Lord Shaftesbury eventually denounced the practice as what he said was barbaric. One can hardly argue with that. Although laws established age restrictions and licensing requirements for chimney sweepers were passed in 1840 and 1875, the covert use of minors persisted. As a result, Victorian society's perception of chimney sweepers changed from one of indifference to activism and compassion. By the late century, the once common climbing boy had become a poignant symbol of innocence lost to Victorian industry, represents the worst excesses of child labor. Well, we're off to a good start, aren't we? I told you that the tone of the video was going to be set from early on. Now, we have another one today that has a recognizable name in our modern era, but things certainly have changed quite a lot since the early times. That is the coal miner. The Industrial Revolution's grim foundation, of course, was the mining of coal, and Victorian miners, men, women, and of course children, toiled to extract this from deep underground seams. Typically, a collier would fill carts or baskets after hewing the coal at the coalface with a pickaxe. In some areas, women known as bearers might carry loads of coal on their backs, while children as young as 5 worked as trappers, opening and closing the ventilation doors, or hurriers, pulling heavy coal carts through low tunnels. In the mines, entire families frequently collaborated to increase productivity. Everybody, from the adult hewer to the youngest assistant, had to keep the coal flowing to the pit shaft, because miners were paid according to the quantity of coal they extracted, which sounds fair until you realize how much they were getting paid. We'll get to that. Toil might include shoveling loose coal, loading it for hoisting to the surface, and swinging a pick for hours in the dark. Coal mines in the Victorian era were notoriously unforgivingly underground. Because tunnels were frequently small and low, passages could only be 2 to 4 feet high. Miners, particularly the young ones, were forced to stoop or crawl while working. Due to the time and financial costs involved, mine owners rarely expanded tunnels beyond what was required. The atmosphere was usually damp, heavy with coal dust, and faintly lit by candles or oil lamps. Dust and toxic gases pervaded the air in some mines due to the oppressively hot conditions and inadequate ventilation. Because of the heat and the dirt, miners frequently worked in their underwear, or in the early decades, actually completely nude. Pools and mud were constantly formed by the water seeping in. If the drainage pumps failed, flooding was a constant risk. And then there were the rats. So many rats, ubiquitous, drawn to the food scraps of miners or the stabled pit ponies. Typically, a miner's shift would last 10 to 12 hours, during which time they worked in near complete darkness, while the sound of picks and shovels reverberated through the tunnels. Sounds risky, doesn't it? Well, that's because it was. The shale or coal roof could suddenly give way at any time, burying miners, and cave-ins and roof collapses were common causes of harm or death. Falls down mine shafts were another deadly hazard, and many miners entered shafts using flimsy lifts or ladders. If a lamp spark ignited the buildup of flammable gas, at the time called fire damp, it was mostly methane, it could cause a catastrophic explosion, and pockets of carbon dioxide, known as choke damp, could suddenly suffocate workers below. I love those Victorian names, fire damp and choke damp. As early gas detectors, miners frequently carried those caged canaries. I'm sure you're familiar with the image. If the bird collapsed, well, that was indication to leave. Miners had to deal with crippling lung conditions over time. Chronic bronchitis and black lung were caused by breathing in constant amounts of coal dust. Persistently hunched posture led to debilitating joint and back issues. Coal miners' lives were remarkably brief in the 1840s, according to investigators. Many of them passed away from illness or accidents in the 30s or early 40s. In fact, the British coal miner had an average life expectancy of only 36 years by the middle of the 19th century, which was significantly less than the national average. Tragic events such as frequent floods or fire damp explosions were also frequent and occasionally killed dozens in a single explosion. Of course, the poor old children did not fare much better. Spending too much time in the dark stunted their growth and harmed their health. Ironically, coal mining might have paid more than some other manual labor occupations during that era. Not much, but it was okay if you wanted to break your back for it. A productive family team could make a modest living because miners were paid per ton of coal. Compared to many farm laborers or factory workers, a skilled adult collier might earn between 15 and 25 shillings per week, but of course this varied by region and coal price. But these salaries, of course, came with a much higher cost. In addition, mine owners had a lot of control over the miners' lives. Families were frequently required to rent company-owned housing, which was deducted from their pay, and they frequently had to use credit to purchase goods at a company store. The family might become impoverished overnight if the father was hurt or the mine was temporarily shut down. Later in the century, strikes for safety improvements and higher wages were common, but miners in the early Victorian era had little bargaining power and no union protection. But there was a social perception element too. Coal miners were viewed differently in Victorian society. You see, on the one hand, miners were acknowledged for performing hard, necessary labor that heated homes, powered railroads and factories. Newspapers would hero miners after a disaster, and middle-class reformers who looked into mines were appalled by what they discovered, particularly when they saw the child labor situation. There was a rough respect for their toughness, too, and the risks that they faced. The Mines Act of 1842, which prohibited women and very young children from working in the mines, was the result of public pressure. Miners, on the other hand, were frequently viewed as an impolite underclass. They were secluded in their colliery villages, prone to strikes and viewed as rough or unruly by certain elites. Surely the same elites who were using that very same coal to heat their homes, I'm sure. They were occasionally stereotyped too by mainstream media as being rough or inebriated. However, the harsh conditions faced by the miners were brought to light by social reformers and the burgeoning labor movement by the late Victorian era. An iconic representation of the period's injustices and the human cost of industrial advancement is that very picture of the soot-blackened miner emerging from that miserable pit. So now we have the third occupation of our day. That is the Matchstick Maker. A little random, I know, but that's just what it is. The production of matchsticks, of course, was a major industry in the days before electric lighting, and was mostly the responsibility of young, poor women and girls. In factories, matchstick makers, often referred to simply as match girls, cut thin sticks of wood, dipped one end into a chemical mixture, and then created the match head. White phosphorus, which I'm sure you know is extremely toxic, was part of a matchtip formula in the Victorian era. And with that being said, you can see how we are leading into some problems. Teenage girls, some as young as 13 or 14, stood in long rows doing the same old things, boxing and drying matches, packing them for sale and dipping the splints into vats of phosphorus. They typically put in 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, with only short breaks. The work was completed quickly to fulfill quotas, while maintaining a high level of detail to prevent breaking the sticks. Hundreds of these workers were employed on assembly lines by factories, as the well-known Bryant and May in London. Match factories were extremely dangerous, claustrophobic, and ill-ventilated. White phosphorus fumes, which smell like garlic, by the way, frequently filled the air. Foremen enforced strict discipline, too, with fines imposed for minor infractions, little things such as talking or even dropping matches, and workers were forced to stand for hours with very little rest. In order to maintain production, the girls in some factories were even made to eat at their workstations. This implied that their food was frequently tainted by the toxic phosphorus that surrounded them. Everyone inhaled the vapor constantly. There was no idea of masks or proper ventilation. They just didn't know. Additionally, the chemical might get under the fingernails or splash onto the skin. The unhealthy atmosphere was exacerbated by the dust from dried matchsticks. Long hours were made even more gloomy by the low lighting, which was typically just daylight coming in through high windows or perhaps gas lamps. There may be wood shavings or chemical residue all over the floors, too. Many of the workers were already vulnerable and undernourished, having come from the East End slums of London, especially in the Bryant and May factory, which conditions, of course, made their health even worse. The most notorious risk associated with this work was known as phossy jaw, a horrifying industrial illness brought on by prolonged exposure to phosphorus. First, victims would have toothaches and swollen gums, followed by oral sores and abscesses. Osteonecrosis, or the actual rotting of the jawbone, would eventually result in glowing greenish white bone tissue, excruciating pain, tooth loss, and an unpleasant discharge from the gums. Facial disfigurement could result from the lower jaw's eventual death and disintegration. Many of the patients died from infections or organ failure brought on by the phosphorus, and their jawbones may be surgically removed to save their lives. And one could hardly imagine how the surgical removal would go back in those times. In the 19th century, phossy jaw affected dozens of match workers. In addition, workers frequently experienced respiratory issues from breathing in wood dust and chemicals, such as asthma, bronchitis, and persistent coughing. If exposure to phosphorus was severe, it could also result in systemic poisoning, which could cause symptoms like seizures or brain damage. Another risk was accidental fires or explosions if a worker accidentally struck a match, or if a batch of white phosphorus dried incorrectly, it could ignite. A small fire could of course quickly grow into a conflagration in a workshop that is so densely populated and filled with flammable materials. Numerous matchgirls had burn scars from mishaps at work. On the factory floor, fainting episodes were caused by the long hours and malnutrition. All things considered, it was probably one of the riskiest manufacturing operations in Victorian Britain. Matchgirls received infamously low pay too, which is no surprise. I'm sure you've seen the trend. A typical match factory worker in the mid-1880s made only 4 to 8 shillings per week, which is equivalent to, 60 to 70 hours of work. Many workers and their families lived on the verge of starvation because this was hardly enough for subsistence. Additionally, employers frequently docked pay with fines. For instance, if an employee was a few minutes late, they might lose half of their day's pay and may be withheld to cover any damaged goods. Because of dire circumstances, the Bryant and May matchgirls famously went on strike in 1888. Hundreds of matchstick makers demonstrated against their poor wages and appalling conditions with the aid of social activist Annie Besant. Pay did remain low, even after the strike brought about some improvements, such as the elimination of fines and a slight increase in wages. But despite their meager pay, many matchgirls served as their families' main providers. Victorian society and factory owners justified the extremely low wages by claiming that the work was unskilled woman's work. Prior to the 1888 strike, matchstick makers were regarded as the lowest strata of society, or were mainly invisible to polite society. Poor working-class girls, they were frequently written off as nothing more than factory drudges. Newspapers and medical journal began to cover this matchmaker's disease. The startling deformity of phossy jaw victims did gradually bring attention to their predicament. The strike by the matchgirls itself was a watershed moment because it attracted sympathy and extensive media coverage. Teenage girls' ability to band together and challenge the influential factory owners shocked the middle-class Victorians. Following the strike, the matchgirls came to represent the early labor movement against the struggle that sweated industries exploited the people through. Society's perception on them was somewhat improved by their increased visibility. They were no longer seen as helpless victims of an industrial disease, but rather as courageous young ladies demanding simply equitable treatment. Nonetheless, all this considered, a match factory girl in Victorian London would frequently be despised on a daily basis for being impoverished and crude. The awful stereotype of the fussy-jawed match girl did not start to disappear from popular culture until the early 20th century, when white phosphorus was finally outlawed and safety precautions were put in place. And at number 4, perhaps you'll consider this as your opportunity to gain your riches. Rat catchers. These workers made a living by eliminating the disease-carrying rodents that plagued Victorian cities. Hunting and catching rats in residences, workplaces, sewers, and streets, well, that was their responsibility. And they used a variety of strategies, such as keeping ferrets or small terrier dogs trained to chase rats out of their hiding spots. Some cleverly lured rats by applying sweet-smelling oils to their skin with their bare hands. They would search barns, city cellars, or haystacks, snatching rodents as they scurried away. In addition, rat trappers set traps to make their own poisons, which they sold on the side. It's not a bad little side hustle, isn't it? Because live rats were frequently sold to public figures or event planners for use in rat-baiting pits, a gruesome spectator sport in which dogs were timed on how quickly they killed dozens of rats. Yes, they had that sort of thing. It was possible to make money by catching rats alive rather than killing them. Kind of like a modern-day Colosseum for animals, I suppose. As a result, a Victorian rat trapper might keep a cage of live rats for sale, or use of the public poisoning of one of 2 rats as an advertisement to show off the potency of his poison. Jack Black. Not that one. We're talking about Queen Victoria's rat catcher, and other well-known rat catchers made a show of their work by putting on brightly colored costumes and showcasing cages filled with hundreds of live rats. It doesn't sound very impressive. Imagine your friend pulls one of them out when you go over for dinner. These hunters, of course, followed rats everywhere, from the most vile city sewers to the luxurious basements of Buckingham Palace. Since rats were most active at night or early in the morning, they frequently worked during these times. The surroundings were dangerous and dirty, of course. In search of a scuttling rodent, a rat catcher may scuttle beneath floors, into garbage piles, or down into the sewer manholes. They had to contend with savage, biting rats in cramped, dimly lit areas. Many only had a candle or lantern with them for illumination. For those working in the city's slums, the smell of sewage and decay was a constant companion. Rat catchers were accustomed to handling wriggling, squealing rats and getting rid of carcasses, so it was certainly not a job for the faint of heart. Furthermore, after capturing the rats, they had to move them, possibly in dozens in wooden cages or burlap sacks, until they could either sell them or find somewhere to put them to death. Just imagine it. You can picture yourself carrying this sack full of live, screeching rats over your shoulder, walking home after a long day of sweaty and disgusting labor. Say what you want about our modern work conditions, but I would not swap them for that. Undoubtedly a disagreeable circumstance. Of course, the work never really ended. They would be out rain or shine, because the infestations never stopped. A certain daring willingness to go anywhere a rat could go was necessary for this job. Now, in terms of occupational hazards, you can imagine that you would often get painful rat bites. And believe me, their jaws are quite strong. Not that I've been bitten by a rat, touch wood, but I know a bit about it. When cornered, scared rats would give ferocious bites and scratches, which frequently resulted in infected wounds. Even a minor bite could result in a serious infection or illness like rat bite fever, if modern antibiotics are not available. And guess what? They weren't. Many rat catchers became ill as a result of handling the rats, which also exposed them to diseases spread by fleas and rodents. The exact link between these diseases and diseases like typhus or plague at the time was not fully understood, germ theory still within its infancy. Now, the actual work environment, alleys, stables, sewers, meant ongoing and brutal exposure to pathogens and filth. In order to kill rats, too, some rat catchers used toxic chemicals, such as strychnine or arsenic, which could, of course, poison the rat catcher himself if handled improperly. There was also the risk of mishap tripping and breaking a limb in a dark cellar, or getting ambushed by angry property owners or guard dogs while skulking around at night. Regarding rat baiting, a rat catcher who kept and sold live rats was at risk of suffering severe bites when moving the rats from one cage to another or into a fighting pit. These bites would have the potential to spread infections that result in sepsis and extreme swelling. Even though some showman rat catchers were brash, many probably had scars on their hands and arms from years of being nipped and scratched. Perhaps they built up an immunity. But to put it briefly, there was a chance of suffering and illness with every rat hunt. As far as the wages, catching rats may be more of a feast or famine situation. Some received a fixed fee per job or per rat killed while working under contract for wealthy estates or city authorities. Others worked as freelancers, charging homeowners to remove pests or selling rats for baiting. Catching dozens of rats in a day could earn a few shillings, because prices may be a few pence per rat. 50 rats in a barn could be cleared by a competent rat catcher with a good dog, earning a respectable day's wage. For example, Jack Black stated that he once provided 2,000 live rats for a rat baiting event. You can certainly see how you could get onto the grind with this kind of work. Ingenious rat trappers also produced and marketed rat poison. Showcasing a poison in the marketplace by immediately killing a rat could increase sales, but the income was not consistent, as infestations fluctuated seasonally, and there were days where there was very little work. As a result, many rat catchers led precarious lives, making ends meet in any way they could. Notably, Jack Black could have been more on a steady wicket due to his unofficial royal appointment, and the fact that apparently he sold fancy colored pet rats. Now that is interesting. However, the average rat catcher, the man on the street, led a modest life, spending a large portion of their income on supplies. We're talking dogs, ferrets, and ingredients for poison, as well as likely medical expenses due to all the bites. Of course, rat catchers were viewed with ambivalence by society. On one hand, they served a vital public function during a time where rats posed a threat to food supplies and public health. They were viewed as courageous, or perhaps insane, individuals who were prepared to perform menial tasks that others simply shied away from. They were fascinatingly portrayed in Henry Mayhew's interviews for London Labour and the London Poor, particularly the quirky Jack Black, who was kind of a folk hero of sorts, especially among the lower classes. Jack Black's semi-official role stems from the fact that even Queen Victoria's court recognized the necessity of having a rat catcher in the residence. Ratcatchers, on the other hand, frequently had low social standing. Their work exposed them to the underclass and made them smell of filth. They could be compared to renegades or outlaws who prowled the streets at strange hours. Their exploits probably piqued interest, but also disgust of the general public. The Victorian rat-catcher was seen as a gritty but necessary character. A refined person would certainly not invite him around to dinner, but he was respected for his practicality, a necessary unpleasantry. They were frequently portrayed as half scavenger, half entrepreneur in the literature and newspapers of the era. And all in all, through all the unfortunate realities of the job, they made city life just that little bit more tolerable by being brave enough to take on the rodent hordes, and perhaps, for some people with a stomach for it, a little bit more entertaining in those rat pit fights. Alright, so the last one for today is the night soil man, also known as the sewer cleaner. Oh, we certainly leave the best to last, don't we? Well, here we go. Of course, cities relied on outhouses and cesspools prior to the invention of modern sewers. The night soil men were responsible for the unpleasant duty of emptying these. After all, someone had to do it. It was the responsibility of a night soil man to gather and transport human waste, which of course they gave the name night soil to make it a little bit more pleasant. These would gather in privies and cesspits during the dead of night. They came with shovels, buckets and carts after midnight, working in teams. One man, known as the holeman, would stand in the privy or dip into the cesspit to scoop the vicious sludge of human waste into tubs. The full tubs would be lifted by his partners and dumped into a big barrel or cart. To get to the cesspool underneath, they frequently had to pry up floorboards or open access holes as they moved from building to building and house to house. By daybreak, they dragged the foul-smelling carts, sometimes pulled by horses, sometimes pushed by hand, out of the city to farms or disposal sites. The waste could be spread as fertilizer in rural areas. In London, some of it was sold to farmers as manure. The others were processed to make chemicals. Strength, coordination, and don't forget the iron stomach, all necessary for the job. They say you can get used to anything, but I don't know. In an effort to empty as many cesspits as possible before dawn, teams of 4 frequently worked in coordinated unison to clear one cesspit effectively before swiftly moving on to the next. The overall working environment, you can imagine, was unbelievably filthy. With the exception of faint lantern light, the men frequently worked in complete darkness, while knee-deep in human filth. In addition to the fact that the waste smelled a little less in the colder night air, they worked in the cold to avoid the public's attention, and perhaps the public's retching. The stench was still overpowering. Householders frequently offered a bottle of gin as a token of appreciation to the night soil crew, probably as much as a courtesy to help them tolerate the stench. The night soilmen frequently smeared tobacco or ointment under their noses to try and deal with it, and they wore tattered, old clothes, because the waste would simply ruin them. With sloshing carts, they lumbered through tiny alleys, occasionally dumping trash onto the streets. After years of accumulation, their work sites or cesspits could be in yards or basements, were frequently overflowing and neglected. Imagine using a shovel that slips in the slime while standing in a pit, walls literally covered in excrement. Although many landlords and residents needed the service, they were still despised by everyone who saw them. These pits also contained hazardous conditions, such as methane and ammonia fumes. The men were soaked with foul matter and exhausted from hours of heaving full tubs. By morning, they may be completely covered in God knows what, and need to hose themselves as well as their tools clean before going to bed. Surely the wives would not want them coming in wearing that, I can imagine. And there was also a genuine chance of contracting an illness or dying in an accident. Cesspools were dangerous places, where a digger could be overcome by poisonous gases such as sulphurous or methane, and either die or lose consciousness. Such incidents continued to happen in Victorian times, as evidenced by the grim tale of Richard the Raker, a worker who literally drowned in human sewage while on the job centuries ago. Rest in peace to that poor soul, and I mean it. The muck itself was contaminated with parasites, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Despite the late Victorian era's acceptance of germ theory, night soilmen were naturally aware that exposure to raw sewage could cause severe illness. Many experienced persistent nausea, headaches, and lung problems as a result of breathing in vapors that were high in ammonia. Hernias, strained backs, and other injuries resulted from the strenuous physical labor of lifting heavy tubs and shoveling tons of waste. Additionally, they had to work in slick, awkward conditions where a slip could result in a broken limb or a plunge into the cesspit. A man's weight could cause a cesspit wall or floor to collapse if it were unstable. Furthermore, night soil workers frequently suffered from infected cuts or skin conditions as a result of improperly sanitary waste handling. After years of work, it was not unusual for them to completely lose their sense of smell. The average night soilman's health unavoidably suffered under the assault of human waste and exhausting nightly toil, even though there was some protection from the strong constitutions and excessive gin consumption, but perhaps that just made things worse. One might anticipate that this job would pay well, and it did, at least by those working-class standards of Victorian times. The night soilmen in London charged around a shilling per cesspit emptied by the middle of the 19th century. In comparison to other labour, this was extremely profitable. Remember the matchstick girls, only making 7 to 8 shillings per week. A skilled tradesman's daily wage was about a shilling, though, so a team that emptied multiple cesspools a night could earn a few shillings, which is equivalent to several days' pay in a single night. Their pay was at least twice of that of the average skilled labourer, according to Henry Mayhew. People only emptied cesspits when they filled up, which may have happened a few times a year per building, so the work was irregular. However, a night soilman may have weeks where he is very busy, and then times where he is not. However, some seasoned night workers made enough to live a little better than the poorest workers. Some even bought off officials or police to get the best routes. However, the high salary comes at a high cost. Some men used a large portion of their income to buy alcohol as a coping mechanism, and the negative health effects of the job could shorten their working years. Notably, cities started making investments in sewer systems in the 1840s and 50s as cholera outbreaks were raging. The old-fashioned night soilman began to become obsolete as the underground sewers grew, as the Bazalgette system in London after 1858, known as the Great Stink. Yes, when the old river had dried up and all of the horrors of it were just scattered along the banks. Anyway, many people lost what had been a filthy but comparatively lucrative job. At the periphery of Victorian society, night soilmen were both essential and despised. The need to stop overflowing cesspools in crowded neighborhoods was reluctantly accepted by city authorities and landlords, However, they were completely shunned. They worked covertly whenever possible, and there were mere mention of their job. Well, that could make the stomach turn. The fact that they were referred to as nightmen or night soilmen suggests that the society would rather they be kept hidden away, out of sight, out of mind. Very few would shake their hand, but they might get paid, sure. Nevertheless, the workers and other lower-class labourers, such as dustmen and toshers, which we will get to in the second part, shared a certain sinister camaraderie. They established a subculture with a rough reputation of its own. They are independent contractors on the very edge of an almost legitimate economy. It's interesting to note that some Victorians were aware of the night soilmen when they were discussing public health issues. Reformers used the ridiculous condition of cesspools and the limitations of using night soil collection to support their calls for modern sewers, and it was very hard to argue against. Society essentially bid farewell to an unsightly necessity by replacing their jobs with the new sewers, thanks to Bazalgette. All things considered, Victorians viewed the night soil man as a rough, unclean person who was needed until the improved sanitation arrived, sometimes pitying him for performing such squalid labor. Their lives spent in knee-deep muck to keep everyone else clean. What do you think? Does that make them the unsung heroes of sanitation? Or perhaps the unsung martyrs? The first job we're looking at today is that of the pure finder. That doesn't sound so bad, doesn't it? Well, although the title, Pure Finder, sounded clean, it was actually one of the dirtiest scavenging jobs that you could get. When they say pure, they actually mean dog waste, which was gathered from the streets by the pure finders, who then sold them to tanneries. You see, in the final stages of leather tanning, dog waste was used to soften and purify hides. The enzymes within it helped remove hair and make the leather a bit more gentle. So, the pure finder's daily routine consisted of searching for dog feces in city alleys, parks, and courtyards, carrying a wooden spatula, a scraper, and a bucket, usually with a lid. At least that helped a little bit. Every time they saw a new pile of dog waste, they would go and add it to the bucket. Pure finders frequently had their regular routes they would check, such locations as where stray dogs roamed or where carriage horses, with accompanying coach dogs of course, might stop. It was a door-to-door, street-to-street hustle. They would either take the collected dung to a dealer or straight to the tannery district. There were numerous tanneries in London's Bermondsey neighbourhood to sell it by the bucketful, once the bucket was full or the day was over. Tanners kindly called the product pure, and those who collected it took the term as a perverse badge of the trade. The word pure itself is derived from the industry. Pure finders trudged through filthy, horse manure-strewn streets of the city, working outside in every weather condition. The grind never stops. In an effort to locate the overnight deposits before street sweepers or pedestrians trampled them underfoot, they frequently got started early in the morning. Of course, the work was very solitary and odorous. With a foul-smelling bucket in hand, a pure finder may walk for miles, with their eyes fixed upon the ground. Some chose to handle the waste with a single glove, usually on the right hand, while others preferred to use their bare hands and simply rinse them off, because it was just difficult to keep the glove clean anyway. I still would have preferred the glove. All day long, they had to put up with the smell of their product coming from the bucket and their hands. Well, one can only imagine when they made the deal at the end of the day at the tannery It was not a handshake agreement. At least I hope not. Added to this, they were, as you can imagine, surrounded by flies. Purefinders frequently slipped on the dung unintentionally or stepped in the very thing that they were looking for. They also needed to be somewhat discriminating, because dog feces at the time might be mixed with straw or have a specific desired consistency. Of course, dried feces would fetch a different price because of the enzymes, not as potent. Trying to do my best with the descriptions here. I know this is a good one to start with. According to some sources, older white dog droppings were rich in ammonia, and drier were actually preferred by purefinders. Other than a scraper, they lacked any practical tools, and their only form of protection was probably just some old boots. A purefinder would be physically exhausted from walking and bending down so much by the end of the day, of course, and they would probably be reeking, which of course caused people to avoid them. They constantly were exposed to bacteria and parasites while handling the animal waste. Through hand-to-mouth contamination, they ran the risk of contracting intestinal infections or illnesses like dysentery, which of course can be a death sentence on its own. Any cut to the hand could become infected with something nasty from the feces if they are not wearing gloves or practicing good hygiene. In addition to being a stressful and frankly demeaning job, purefinders frequently faced harassment from street urchins or derision from bystanders for literally picking up waste. Additionally, approaching a new pile could enrage a stray dog defending its territory, increasing the risk of dog bites. The contents of the bucket would stew and release ammonia fumes on hot days, which could cause respiratory and visual irritation. Purefinders had their own special little disease, Glover's itch, a type of eczema that is known to occur in people who come into contact with tanning liquids such as dog dung solution or chronic skin conditions of the manner. Malnutrition and fatigue were also risks. Many purefinders were elderly people, unable to perform more strenuous labor, and the lengthy walks, while malnourished, could result in collapses or disease. Although it wasn't a job as immediately dangerous as mining or toshing, the health effects of spending every day in filth, well, they were as real as any other danger. As their immune systems were continuously put to the test, furthermore, purefinders' mental health might be impacted by their social isolation, because few friends wanted to hang out with somebody who smelled like a kennel. Now, we have talked in the previous episode about the night men who would go around and empty the sewers. At least they usually worked in teams. But the purefinder, that was a solitary existence. Apart from being a source of mockery, they were essentially invisible in society. But it may surprise you to learn that this wretched labor could actually provide a small but necessary income. Not as good as some other things, but certainly not as bad. For each bucket of dog dung, purefinders were usually paid 8 to 10 pence, about half a shilling per bucket, since 20 pence is equivalent to a shilling, by the way. If lucky, a diligent purefinder could fill a bucket or two each day. Midway through the 20th century, Henry Mayhew observed that a hard-working purefinder could earn about £13 annually, which is definitely not to be snuffed at for the poor. It was marginally harder than what a street beggar might have make, on par with the earnings of other street scavengers. Price may be influenced by the quality of the pure. Dry, aged droppings with high ammonia content were actually reported to command a higher price. As long as there was supply, there was constant demand, because tanning was simply required as much as possible. Since pure finders only had a bucket and possibly a cheap scraper, their earnings were not offset by operating expenses, perhaps with the exception of soap and water if they bothered with that, but I'm not holding my breath, or rather I am holding my breath. Of course, there was a limited supply of waste on London streets, and hundreds of pure finders were looking for it, so the competition could be quite intense. Ironically, pure finders offered a kind of cleaning service, because more dogs meant more waste, which made the streets unpleasant for everyone else. At least with the pay, it was somewhat on subsistence level, with their meager daily income going towards tea, stale bread, and possibly inexpensive housing. Many pure finders lived hand to mouth, which is probably not the best way to put it, but that's how it is. Now, in Victorian England, pure finders were considered to be at the bottom of the social scale. Their occupation was viewed by their peers as both repulsive but also somewhat humorous. Because of their work, people would avoid pure finders in conversation and in society, and they would literally avoid them on the street because they smelled horrible. There was occasionally a hint of sympathy, because, as Mayhew had noted, there were frequently elderly women or poor widows who simply had no other way to make money, and you must feel sorry for them. Imagine your own grandmother, or your mother, grandfather, or your father having to do such a thing. You wouldn't want them to be thrown away by society like this. However, these pure finders were frequently the target of jokes, because Victorians had a strong sense of scatological humour, and the pure finders were simply the most convenient target. Henry Mayhew details pure finders in London Labour and the London Poor, highlighting their surprisingly business-like approach to such a filthy trade and securing their place in history. But what about the tanners? Surely they were happy to receive the product that they so needed. Well, tanners did not show respect for the people who gathered, even though they undoubtedly valued the material they bought. In essence, society made a collective effort to ignore them, much like the aforementioned night soil men, since they removed something unsavory and exclusively beneficial to industry. A pure finder would be greeted with insults or curled noses, and that's if they were noticed at all. Nevertheless, they were only one of many scavengers in the street work community, besides, mudlarks, toshers, rag and bone men. Things like this, we'll get to them. All of whom just trying to make a living from the city's abandoned waste. Since someone had to sit next to you at the end of the day when you smell of such a substance, well, they might find some camaraderie in perhaps sticking to their own. However, in general, Victorian society regarded their line of work with a mixture of disgust and humour, appreciating that someone was willing to do it, but content to keep them at a distance. Well, once again, we're off to a good start, aren't we? Alright, now these one or two videos are perhaps the filthiest videos that I've done, so you'll have to forgive me when I'm trying to explain things in the most polite manner as possible. But at least we got that one out of the way. This one's not so bad. The Mudlark. In essence, a mudlark was a river scavenger who made a living by searching for valuable items in the mud of the Thames River at low tide. These individuals were usually children or extremely impoverished adults. They would wade into the muck-covered banks of the river when the tide was out and pour through the slime in search of treasures, or more frequently trash that could be sold. Typical finds included stray pieces of wood, lost coins, bones, pieces of rope or canvas, lumps of coal that had fallen from barges, and scrap metal such as nails and bits of iron. Driftwood might be collected and then sold as firewood. Bones and metal could be sold to rag and bone shops for a few pence, and coal could be dried and sold cheaply to low-income families for fuel. Mudlarks were basically the best recyclers of Victorian waste. After all, everything sort of got thrown into the river. Now, no one really hired a mudlark. Instead, they just went out and did the work, selling whatever they discovered. A large number of mudlarks, too, were homeless kids who saw it as a daily struggle for survival. They waited for the waters to subside before squelching into the dirty riverbed, frequently wearing tattered clothing and simply going barefoot, searching for solid objects by feeling through the sticky mud. Now, I said that this one was slightly less unpleasant, but only slightly. Of course, the mudlark had its own dangers, perhaps more than the pure finder. He lived in a hazardous, cold and dirty environment. During the Victorian era, the Thames shore was essentially an open sewer, with raw industrial and human waste flowing straight into the river. See The Great Stink of London. I made a video on that a while back. That might interest you. Mudlarks would be wading through a disgusting concoction of human waste, dead animals, rotting trash and mud. One could easily sink to their knees in the thick, sucking mud. In the summer, the stench was intolerable. In the winter, the icy mud would almost have them succumb to frostbite. They frequently worked in loose bunches of groups, not so much because they wanted to work together, but because they were all drawn to the same low tide, picking through mud and sludge up to their waist. The mudlarks spent hours hunched over. They ran the risk of getting cut by jagged objects that could sever bare feet or fingers, such as broken glass, rusty nails, and scrap metal that were concealed beneath the mire. They also needed to watch the river, because the tides of the Thames, they could rise swiftly, and many mudlarks could be, and were, caught off guard as the water rushed back, the unwary drowning. By the end of a session, they were usually covered in head to toe in foul-smelling mud, and clothing offered very little protection. They would drag themselves to a dealer, such as a rag shop, to sell their haul after collecting their finds in a sack or pockets, frequently still shivering and covered in muck. Working outside in the blazing sun or driving rain was demoralizing and exhausting, and they were always worried that the next step or wave might be their last. One could argue that mudlarks had to deal with every danger that the city had to offer. Drowning was a risk because of the incoming tide, especially for those who might venture a little too far out. A tiny mudlark might become trapped in sludge that resembles quicksand and be unable to escape, and the mud itself could turn into a maze. Cuts on the feet and other physical injuries were frequent. Because of the filth, even small wounds frequently resulted in dangerous infections. A large number of mudlarks hobbled on infected legs or feet. Henry Mayhew recounts a child who was lamed for months after he sunk a copper nail into his foot in the mud. Diseases were common. Wading in the sewage exposed one to parasites, cholera, typhoid, or hepatitis. They most likely suffered from diarrhea and chronic illness. Additionally, the work was sometimes very cold, causing rheumatism or hypothermia in people who were always wet. Mudlarks frequently had chronic coughs, which could have been caused by the tuberculosis made worse by their appalling living circumstances. There was also the chance of getting bitten by a sewer rat, which was common in the mud, and could bite a scavenger who was sticking a hand into a crack. Another risk was the human element. Occasionally, mudlarks would venture too close to shipyards and docks, where they were not welcome, and might be pursued or even attacked by watchmen. It was a psychologically difficult existence. Child mudlarks lived day to day, constantly competing with one another for scraps, which could result in fights between the frantic scavengers. As a last humiliation, a mudlark might be arrested or imprisoned if they were found to be stealing. For example, stealing some coal from a barge instead of merely picking up random lumps on the shore. In fact, a 13-year-old mudlark had told Mayhew that he would rather be confined for a brief period of time, where he would receive food and dry shelter, than to be left freely on the muddy banks. The mudlark's earnings were scarce and uncertain too. According to Mayhew's work, the majority of mudlarks only made an average of 3 pence per day, when 12 pence was worth a shilling. That is 3 in old pence, basically not even a quarter of a shilling. It could hardly amount to 3 or 4 pounds in a year. A mudlark might find enough to bring a few pence on a good day, which would include a half-pound of coal, a few nails, and possibly, if they were lucky, a discarded tool. Nothing at all on a bad day, though. To supplement this, some mudlarks turned to petty theft, which is extremely dangerous and involves stealing small items from unattended boats. A piece of bread, some boiled potatoes, possibly a night in a doss house, were their only sources of income, because they had no expenses, living on the streets in subpar housing, and possibly eating food scraps or the cheapest bread. In order to pay for a shared meal, child mudlarks occasionally joined forces with parents or siblings. Many of them were in danger of starvation because of how precarious their existence was. They had no savings, and were unable to work if they became ill or hurt. Mudlarks frequently resorted to begging when it was feasible, because on a good day, even begging could produce more than the mud of the river. To put it briefly, mudlarking offered little more than enough to get by, and frequently less. Mudlarks were generally regarded by Victorians with a mixture of sympathy and disgust. They represented the most impoverished people. They were ragged, mud-caked urchins that shocked anyone who came across them, and Mayhew said that they were certainly the most deplorable in appearance of any I have met. Many middle-class and upper-class spectators thought of mudlarks as pathetic street children, similar to the impoverished beggars or crossing sweepers. However, there was also a regrettable propensity to blame the impoverished for their own circumstances. Some perceived mudlarks as vagrants or truants who opted for a lazy life of scavenging, rather than proper employment, ignoring the fact that you would hire a child without shoes and covered in sewage, of course. Not the best impression at the interview. Mudlarks weren't as common in literature and the media as pickpockets or chimney sweepers. You've probably not heard of them. But when they were used as representations of filth. It wasn't like the pickpockets and chimney sweepers in movies like Oliver, where it's this. No, they're dirty, fine, yes, they're criminals, but it's accompanied by the song and dance, and it's romanticized somewhat. Mudlarks were nothing like that. Mudlarks were absolutely miserable. They were occasionally, even though to be bothersome, or small-time criminals prowling the docks. Sometimes, especially if they were suspected of stealing, the law would round them up and send them to reformatories or workhouses. Perhaps a step up. However, the traditional mudlark became less common as sewers and river cleanliness marginally improved toward the end of the century. Of course, they were primarily viewed as these tragic characters of Victorian times, with children and the elderly women wading in poisonous mud for a few scraps. Today, observers like us frequently romanticize them as tough scavengers. Either way, they were living proof of the poverty and filth that industrial wealth had not yet eradicated, and their existence contradicted Victorian notions of progress, right there on the river for everyone to see. Although some kind-hearted people made an effort to assist the Mudlarks by providing other jobs or care. Mayhew himself describes helping one boy land a job as a printer, by the way. Mudlarks generally continue to live on the periphery of society, with the exception of a startling tale about the extremes of poverty. They operated in the shadow of London's affluence, and were mainly, like all the others, disregarded. Okay, so next up on the list of dream jobs, we have the sewer Tosher, which sounds exactly as bad as it is. Toshers, also known as sewer hunters, were daring scavengers who ventured into the maze-like sewers of London, once London had sewers, in order to retrieve misplaced valuables. The city's sewer system was outdated, of course, overflowing labyrinth that carried waste beneath the streets by the Victorian era. Entering these sewers, occasionally via manholes or intercepting drains, and looking through the raw sewage for anything of value was how these Toshers earned their living. Coins dropped down grates, pieces of jewelry, or cutlery washed from sinks, scrap metal, and even the occasional misplaced watch or ring were actually common finds. But to rake through the sludge and debris, they employed long poles with hooks or hose on the end. They scooped and sorted as they methodically worked in small groups through the mess. A few coins, or maybe some tools and copper nails that fell from workshops upstream, could be considered a good haul. Toshers kept these in their leather aprons, pockets, or in sacks. Later, the loot would be cleaned up and either pawned or sold for money. In essence, they viewed the sewer as a possible treasure trove hidden beneath the surface. It was frequently a covert operation because of the health and potential legal ramifications. Many Toshers worked at night or in the early morning to avoid being discovered. Now, as for the sewers, you might imagine that they were not in the best of shape. Imagine wading through raw sewage that is knee or thigh deep, foul-smelling mixtures of urine, industrial chemicals, human waste, and trash that is moving slowly through brick tunnels with very little airflow. Toshers usually wore heavy boots and old patched canvas pants, a leather apron usually, occasionally a cloth around their nose and mouth. To provide light in the complete darkness, they fastened lanterns to their chests. The tunnels were small inside, with some parts requiring stooping or even crawling. There were places where the oxygen content of the foul air could be oppressively low. Along the walls or around their feet, they had to contend with hordes of sewer rats. When upstream sluice gates were opened or during periods of heavy rain, abrupt flushes of water could surge through, sending a wave of waste that could knock a man off his feet and subsequently drown him. The constant fear of being swept away certainly helped keep them vigilant, but the physical surroundings were also dangerous, because old brickwork could suddenly collapse. Some tunnels featured sump holes or steep drops. For safety, Toshers frequently worked in groups. One could stand watch, or assist a friend in climbing or escaping if necessary. They spoke in a strangely resonant shouts or whispers, slogging through sucking mire, carrying a sack of scrap metal, and shoveling through thick filth was back-breaking work. Naturally, the dim light of oil lanterns, was responsible for everything, creating unsettling shadows in an area that most people wouldn't venture to visit. Keeping a low profile, slipping out of a manhole with their finds, hopefully before anyone noticed, that was all part of the job. Even though these men probably stank to high heaven above ground after a sewer foray, I'm sure you'd probably smell them before you saw them. One of the riskiest occupations, that's what it was. Toxic and explosive gases were present in the sewers. Methane or hydrogen sulfide pockets could suffocate a Tosher or spontaneously catch fire. Many people carried a candle as a makeshift gas detector. If it suddenly died, it was time to run because of the contaminated air. Additionally, there was a direct risk of disease. Coming into contact with deadly pathogens could cause cholera, typhoid, dysentery, etc. And the dirty water could easily infect cuts or scratches, causing severe illness or even death. Sewer workers were also at risk for rat bite fever and other illnesses due to the possibility of being bitten by swarming rats. If a Tosher makes a mistake in dark waters, they could be completely dunked down, ingesting sewage or possibly drowning if they panic. The abrupt floods of wastewater were also well known, especially during periods of intense precipitation. The flow could be made a trickle 1 minute, and then a wall of water the next. Toshers might be beaten up against tunnel walls, or carried away and drowned in the sewage. Another nightmare scenario was tunnel collapses, where an old brick ceiling might fall and trap, crushing the Tosher. Even in the absence of accidents, the job could be taxing. Continual exposure to filth caused lung problems, infections, and skin diseases due to the miasma. Their lives were probably also shortened by the stress and fear they endured. Given that starvation was frequently the alternative, it is telling that Toshers continued to operate in spite of these risks. And speaking of money and all the rest, a Tosher's income was entirely based on the treasure they discovered. So there was no set salary. It's all up to you. Surprisingly, compared to other slum jobs, some people found it profitable despite the risks. Coins and metal worth a few shillings could be found during a successful sewer night. A Tosher could make a lot of money if they discover a silver spoon or perhaps some jewelry. A silver spoon could sell for several shillings, you know. Numerous coins, bits of plate, and other items ended up in the muck, according to Mayhew's account. Although it was very unpredictable, a Tosher might typically produce 1 or 2 shillings of scrap and coin in a day. A gold ring, or a few misplaced pennies, could be found on some nights, while others would be fruitless. Toshers were free to practice their trade prior to 1840, but they had to be cunning after it became illegal rather, to enter sewers without authorization. Their haul had to outweigh the additional risks or fines or jail time, but that didn't stop them. Coins were either spent or kept. Due to the group nature, they occasionally combined fines and divided profits, particularly when one man made a significant discovery. One of the reasons why the job remained alluring is that there are stories of some seasoned Toshers making enough money to feed their families and even dress a little better than mudlarks or purefinders. Even so, a Tosher's pay might have been comparable to that of unskilled workers, a few shillings per week on average, albeit with much more variation. In essence, it was similar to gambling in a sewer. You get rich one day, you get poor the next. But they continued because of that small chance that they might hit the jackpot down there somewhere in the drains. Toshers were viewed as members of the city's shadowy underclass like everybody else mentioned in this one, who were frequently criminalized and mainly invisible. Although they probably cleared some blockages by removing debris, authorities saw them as trespassers and accused them of causing damage to the sewer infrastructure or creating blockages. Toshers were specifically targeted by a law that was passed in 1840 that prohibited entering the sewers without authorization. But that did not stop them. The Toshers had to work covertly, which gave their persona a hint of Robin Hood if we could put it that way. Toshers may have been admired by the impoverished for their courage, and the sporadic tale of striking it rich underground. Because of their unique clothing and equipment, some Londoners may have recognized these men when they saw them walking to a manhole with a lantern and hook in hand. Sewer hunters were generally viewed by the general public with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Middle-class readers shuddered at the thought of people literally swimming in sewage for money after journalists like Henry Mayhew spoke about it. The Toshers were frequently grouped with other scavenger occupations as proof of the impoverished people's resourcefulness and desperation. But the Tosher era gradually faded as the modern closed sewer system, established after the reconstruction of the Basilicat in 1860s, took over. Daring sewer pirates from a bygone London, they became almost legendary. In conclusion, people were glad they didn't have to go down into the sewers, even though Victorians probably thought of them as vile criminals or pathetic desperados, depending on one's level of compassion. In the depths of the city's underworld, the memories of the Toshers are both as heroes of survival and also outlaws. Right, next one. The crossing sweeper. An impoverished youngster, known as a crossing sweeper, would stake out a portion of the street, usually a busy intersection or crossing, and keep it clear of trash, mud, and horse manure, so that people could dress without getting their boots or dresses dirty. Many pedestrians welcomed this service during a time where the streets were filthy, covered in dust and trash, and of course a lot of horse dung. To quickly clear a path, the crossing sweeper would wait until they noticed a well-dressed individual about to leave a curb before leaping forward with a broom. They did not have a schedule or an employer, so they worked informally. And every sweeper selected a patch of the street and made an effort to keep it noticeably cleaner than the neighborhood. The sweeper would frequently move forward when a prospective customer crossed, constantly sweeping to make sure the following few yards were clear. Kind of like a weird game of curling. With an outstretched hand or cap, the child may follow the person who crossed in hope of receiving a tip for the service. When several affluent individuals arrived, the child hurried back and forth, making every effort to serve them all. They frequently swept vigorously while addressing people politely, saying things like, "Allow me, sir." In essence, these young business people transformed a broom and fast feet into a means of surviving. Clever work. Not a bad idea. In addition to physically sweeping, their duties included establishing diplomatic claims to territory, and occasionally repelling rival sweepers and children, and gaining enough favor to be paid. Working in the open street, crossing sweepers were subject to all types of weather condition, as well as the ongoing dangers of city traffic. The street turned to sludge when it rained, and swirled with dust when it didn't. A sweeper may stand on a corner for hours on end, inhaling the smoke and manure stench. They had to jump between moving carts and carriages if they were not careful. A wheel or horse could run them over. Even though it might be extremely cold in the winter, they'd still be out there, possibly in the ragged clothing, shoveling slush or snow as far away as they could. The heat and the smell, well, the summer would make that unbearable. They had no official claim on the location, though, which made their job more difficult because they could be ejected by police officers for being beggars or having their spotless crossing ruined by more muck being washed over it by street sprinklers. Their primary tool was a broom, which was frequently used and second-hand. Many crossing sweepers felt every cold spot and jagged rock because they were barefoot, or at least ill-shod. They also needed to stay alert because another urchin might take over if they left their crossing even for a short time, I had to get water or follow a tip. As a result, it was a persistent, nervous presence on the corner of the street. They were frequently shouted at or ignored in social situations. They would listen to the sound of their hoofs, the cries of those passing by, and sometimes the taunts of onlookers who thought that they were an annoyance. Despite these challenges, many people chose it over direct begging, because at least they were helping others, and felt somewhat respected when a nice woman smiled and gave them a penny. In any case, a crossing sweeper's life was full of illness and peril. As previously stated, there was a significant risk of traffic accidents, because small children could be easily trampled when they darted in front of horses. In such incidents, some kids suffered broken bones or worse. Additionally, they were continuously breathing in dust and all manner of filth, which increased their risk of lung infections and persistent coughing. Frequent colds, pneumonia, and other illnesses resulted from being outside in all weather conditions with insufficient clothing. Due to their weakened immune systems, and the fact that many sweepers were homeless or from extremely low-income families, malnutrition was widespread. They were also exposed to disease-causing agents by working among the trash of the streets. Although the link to the contaminated dirt was not entirely clear, Victorian streets during cholera outbreaks were particularly dangerous. Additionally, crossing sweepers could hurt themselves by slipping on cobblestones or using their brooms. For a child, the job could be extremely stressful because of the ongoing concern about earning money, the potentially violent territorial disputes with other homeless kids, and the general roughness of life on the streets. Some were the targets of bullying or exploitation by gangs or older boys who might tax their corner, or simply just beat them up and take their money. Many sweepers started at dawn and stayed out until dusk, constantly on the lookout, rarely resting, so mental and physical exhaustion, well, that was all but inevitable. They lived day in, day out in danger, rejection, cold, and hunger for a meager wage. They relied solely on tips to make their ends meet. They had no guaranteed income. In exchange for a timely sweep, generous pedestrians might give a penny or two. Some donated bread crusts, farthings, or halfpennies. Most just ignored them and gave them nothing. After all, they didn't ask for the service. In a busy area of town, a conscientious child could earn several pence on a good day. Crossing sweepers hoped for the occasional copper from onlookers, which is essentially an income comparable to begging. In an effort to add a little stability, some wealthy people adopted a regular crossing sweeper and made it a point to tip their local child every day. Earnings, however, were inconsistent overall. On a wet day, there'd be fewer people around, therefore fewer tips. Or on the other hand, a messier street would make their service more necessary, but more difficult to perform. They indirectly save money on clothing by sweeping and preventing muck from ruining their clothes, but don't be fooled. The majority of crossing sweepers barely made ends meet. Some days, there was nothing at all, but if they were lucky, you could expect 4 to 6 pence a day. Just a little bread and possibly a doss house bed for the night could be purchased with this amount of money. They also had to perform odd jobs or beg in their free time, if we had to call it that. Notably, Dickens and other authors occasionally depicted kind-hearted men giving a poor sweeper half a crown, or substantial 2.5 shillings, but in practice that would have been extremely uncommon. Therefore, even though the public paid them, the rate was low and completely determined by others. In Victorian cities, crossing sweepers were a common sight, and frequently provoked a mixture of pity and derision. The genteel classes frequently appeared in Victorian literature as archetypes of the deserving poor, because they found a small boy sweeping a path with earnestness to be both pathetic and enduring in a sentimental way. Since they at least made an effort to earn their money, many people thought they were superior to ordinary beggars. Indeed, it was common to refer to crossing sweepers as just a step up from beggars. They were cited by some philanthropists as proof that poverty and child labor needed to be addressed, but on the other hand, some people thought they were just an annoyance, especially riders or coachmen who might have to slow down for a child who was running around, or pedestrians who saw an overzealous sweeper hounding them for a tip. One can imagine that that is annoying. Either way, crossing sweepers were occasionally ridiculed as petty or cheeky in historical caricatures and illustrations. However, they also gained some notoriety, According to a possibly fictitious tale, Queen Victoria even invited a crossing sweeper to her wedding, highlighting their status as representations of the underprivileged. They began to disappear, however, as the 19th century went on, and cities began to organize street cleaning. But for a large portion of Victoria's reign, they served as a constant reminder of the glaring class divide. Ragged kids, making room for lords and elegantly dressed ladies. Sometimes their presence pricked society's conscience. Sometimes. Overall, the society that created the need for crossing sweepers provided little systemic assistance to them, but they were accepted and occasionally treated with kindness by individuals. Many Victorian memoirs contain memories of a specific little crossing sweeper, demonstrating how these kids were subtly assimilated into the urban fabric and continued to represent the make-do mentality of the urban poor. And finally, we reach number 5. This one's a little bit different. I've saved the most interesting one to last. Perhaps not what you were expecting. The Resurrectionist, also known as the Body Snatcher. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Well, the macabre practice of exhuming recently buried bodies and selling them to medical schools for dissection was practiced by resurrectionists, also known as body snatchers, in the early 19th century, overlapping with the early Victorian years. Even though legal changes caused the practice to decline in the middle of the Victorian era, it still had a negative impact on employment during that time. These people, who frequently worked in gangs, would scout cemeteries at night, find recent burials, ideally of those impoverished, whose graves had fewer safeguards, and just dig up the coffin. Because damaged bodies were less valuable, it was their grim duty to remove the body without causing any harm. They frequently did this by tunneling at the head of the coffin, cracking it open, and removing the corpse by the arms. To avoid being noticed by family members or cemetery watchmen watching the grave, they had to work fast, but quietly. To conceal the theft, they would rebury the empty coffin after the body was recovered. After that, the body would be placed in straw-filled sacks or crates and delivered, typically at night or right on dawn, to a surgeon or anatomy instructor who'd be willing to pay. I'm serious. This actually happened. It happened all the time. Of course, at any given time, resurrectionists needed to know which private anatomy lecturers or medical schools were purchasing the bodies. In essence, they participated in a covert supply chain as suppliers. They went straight to murder in well-known cases like Burke and Hare in order to obtain bodies, although they were not considered body snatchers because they killed rather than dug up. Their case highlighted the demand. We'll talk more about them. However, the majority of resurrection men continued to just do it the old-fashioned way. Dig. A successful night could include 1 to 3 body thefts. Important duties include finding a target, excavating effectively, moving a bulky body, and haggling over payment with reticent surgeons. The working conditions were, as one might expect, pretty appalling. The snatchers operated in cemeteries and in the dark, usually during bad weather because it was less likely they would be discovered. Rainy and moonless nights were ideal. Under tremendous time pressure and stress, they carried out strenuous manual labor, such as moving heavy earth and digging with a shovel. The surroundings were a mixture of the smell of recently turned earth and the early stages of decomposition. They occasionally exhumed bodies, only a day or two after burial, so the corpses were largely undamaged. But other times, if they were not careful, they would come across a body that was already decaying, which was not only less valuable, but physically repulsive. For their own safety, and because doctors might reject them, they usually avoided coffins of people who died of highly contagious diseases. But really, you couldn't be sure what you'd find. They were exposed to blood, bodily fluids, and illness while handling corpses. They frequently only had sacks, shovels, and crowbars as tools. In winter, the work was even more difficult if the ground was frozen. Additionally, while they dug, they were required to remain silent, speaking in only gestures and whispers, because graveyards might have armed guards, and citizens occasionally organized watch groups. There was a great fear of being discovered. In order to deter the body snatchers, traps such as spring guns or coffin torpedoes, basically explosive devices, have been reported, and that pose a real threat. It's not a new thing. Think about the old grave robbing problems we have in different parts of the world. People generally don't want it to happen, and if it does happen, they certainly want to make it as unpleasant for the thieves as possible. But of course, getting the body is one thing. Then you have to transport it. And this process through quiet city streets after they had recovered was just as nerve-wracking. If somebody happened to stumble upon a cart carrying a corpse in the middle of the night, it could turn into a mob lynching. Imagine that. Walking through the streets, every little noise, heart racing, while riding that little rattling cart with a corpse wrapped in a sack at your feet. Extremely stressful, very gory, full of crime and death. This profession came with both legal and physical risks, you see. Body snatchers ran the risk of catching diseases from the cadavers. For example, a body that died of cholera or tuberculosis, well, that might still be infected. And you do not want to get cholera or tuberculosis. They may sustain also cuts or injuries from broken coffin wood, coffin nails. Scratches could also become septic, or even while digging. It's bad for your back. Rheumatism or illness were frequently the results of exertion on chilly, rainy nights. Many likely experienced psychological trauma because of their fear of being captured and the ongoing close contact with the dead. But the greatest danger was being apprehended by the police, or perhaps even more dangerous, irate family members. Regardless, the vigilantes continued to administer street justice, despite the fact that body snatching was only a misdemeanor, believe it or not. But interesting, stealing a body wasn't a felony under British law because the corpse wasn't considered property. Yeah, nice little fact for you there. Either way, that did not stop the vicious mob beatings. And, well, it's probably something I would turn a blind eye to as well. They risked fines or jail time if they were caught by the actual law, as well as public shame. Some churchyards employed armed patrols to put up heavy mort safes, iron cages over graves, that is. A body snatcher attempting to get past them might be just shot on sight. Then there is the case of Burke and Hare, which we have mentioned, who began as shady body dealers but turned to murder, raising the possibility that any resurrection man could cross that line. the public's hatred of body snatchers peaked after their crimes were made public, because suspicion of serious robbing could spark riots. Resurrectionists of the later era thus operated in greater danger. They were also at risk when transporting corpses. If a constable stopped them and discovered a body, they were done for. Some body snatchers had escape plans or carried weapons for pursuits across cemeteries because of the high stakes. One mistake could result in death at the hands of others, or at least incarceration. But the financial lure persisted in spite of everything. Due to the lack of legality around the obtained bodies, medical schools and private anatomy lecturers were willing to pay handsome fees for fresh cadavers. Early in the 1800s, a single corpse could bring anywhere up to £10, which is about several hundred US today. In the Victorian era, an adult corpse in London would normally cost about £4, more if it was in good condition, less for a child, which, we don't want to talk about that, don't we? Given that a worker may make only £1 per week, one person's wages could cover a month or more, so that's certainly tempting. Even so, two men splitting £4 for a night's work was profitable, but that's if they could pull it off regularly. Resurrectionists typically worked in teams and divided the profits. In Edinburgh, the notorious Burke and Hare were paid between £7 and £10 per body, which of course pushed them to take drastic measures. Frequently, their money was paid in cash, discreetly, and without inquiry. Due to its legality, the trade was based on supply and demand, with prices rising as demand peaked during winter months, during dissection season, when bodies were kept longer and medical classes were in season. A few body snatchers turned it into a semi-regular occupation, possibly making a meager living that was on par with that of a skilled craftsman, albeit occasionally. But there was a great deal of unpredictability, you see. Sometimes you'd score several bodies. Other nights you'd just get nothing, due to the guards, the soil being too hard. Yeah. I guess you could say it was a dead industry. Well, the Anatomy Act of 1832, which permitted medical schools to use unclaimed bodies, such as those from workhouses, thereby undermining the black market, also closed the window for making large sums of money as public awareness increased. The traditional resurrectionist trade essentially died out after that. It was buried. However, in the early years of the period, body snatching was a quick, if morbid way, for those who were too desperate or bold to make other amounts of money in different ways. Of course, the public, they feared and hated body snatchers everywhere. No one pitied them. They were perhaps the most hated of these professions that I've listed. Not because they were disgusting or smelly or anything else, just because they were morally reprehensible. They offended Victorian religious and moral sensibilities by violating the sanctity of the grave. There was a great deal of fear and rage at the thought of a loved one's body might be dug up and taken away for dissection. As a result, people started forming vigilante groups, guarding cemeteries, bought heavy coffin locks, and so forth. Now, public outrage was sparked when newspapers reported on ghouls caught in the act. That was the revelation of Burke and Hare's crimes in 1828, which technically went beyond body snatching to include body supplying through murder. It was a scandal that appalled the entire British public. To kill someone for anatomical gain, the word burking even made its way into the language. Nonetheless, the public had not forgotten the incidents that continued into the early Victorian era, late 1830s. When apprehended, the body snatchers were subjected to extrajudicial punishment. It was not common for a vengeful mob to severely beat a resurrection man or to toss rocks and trash at him while being transported to court. They were effectively a boogeyman in popular culture, Parents who scare their kids by telling them if they misbehave, the body snatchers would come and get you. The horrifying trade is remembered as one of the most ghoulish jobs in history, a dark aspect of Victorian life that most people were eager to put behind them forever. They forced society to face the tension between moral ethics and medical advancement. Well, what a miserable little time we had together today. Well, I suppose it's a story that needs to be told. What better way to tell it? In any case, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMS, HH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katy B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, and Alexa. Thank you very much. And that's it from me today. Feel free to watch another video if you want. I don't know, do whatever you like. Maybe it's it from you too. In any case, as usual, thank you for watching. Lots of love to you all. And see you next time. Farewell for now.